Hi there, this is Carl Irwin with another Blender tutorial. We're going to be looking at additional scenes in this short film that we're making, considering these space vistas and space scenes that we're writing music to as well. So this will be a Blender tutorial. We're going to be looking at nebula creation, and we've looked at this before in some other tutorials in the Hacking the Viewport series, but we're going to look for a more photoreal kind of approach here that's using NASA imagery that we'll be putting into three-dimensional space. We'll look at a couple of different procedures for doing that and a few different ideas that you can mix and match to make a few different kinds of perspectives and scenes. So just to show you what we're talking about, here's an example from the film. This is a low quality but high resolution rendering of the film. So you can see a parallax motion here and some different kinds of clouds that we're flying through, moving through. There's a lens flare out there. This is a planet. Move forward here. So here's another example of a nebula, more distant shot, a bit of parallax motion. Some more planetary figures. Here's another nebula. Seems to have a three-dimensional space to it. And here's another one. Has a lot of different elements in there. Go back and look at that again. So you can see there's a lot of depth on this example. And then there's this one here, is kind of a fly-through, as if we're flying into something, and there's a great deal of three-dimensional depth on this one as well. Now we're going to use some very simple techniques to achieve some of these ideas. Before I do that, though, I wanted to kind of catch up a little bit on the last tutorial that I did on planets and just touch on one element that I didn't discuss, and that is the addition of other planets. So we can make one planet and you can create moons for that planet. Very simply, just duplicate your geometry there, move it to a different space, and then scale it down as I did here. So I've got a couple of moons around this planet, and they're just the same planet moved out there. If you want to change the materials, you can, but the key is to try to get just the right balance of detail and simplicity in your scene, particularly with these space scenes. You can get a little overboard with them, and you want to be careful with that. But adding a few other minor details can be very beneficial, or adding, say, another planet in the background, two planets that are very close to each other. You kind of be breaking the laws of physics there, but we can have these little moons that might be in orbit, might be a better way to go. Also, creating rings. Creating rings is very simple. I just put very basic Blender materials on them, just color materials, and I just imported or created some geometry from a circle, and then I subdivided the circle and then deleted the centermost vertices so that I had a ring, and I made a couple of those rings and generated an array and changed the colors on them. That's it. So you can generate rings in that way. But anyway, that's just a quick catch up on the planetary side of things. Let's look at nebula. Let's open up a new project. And the first thing we're going to do is get rid of the default cube, and we won't need any lights in this at all. We're going to go to the top view, and we will align our active camera to the view. And then what we're going to do is, on the first example, we'll start easy. We're going to do something we've already done, and that is to import some images as various planes that we can create our scene from. Now, I just want to remind you about draw order. Draw order is a limitation in OpenGL in which Blender in particular wants to draw the items that are closest to the camera first and were created first, and that's how the alpha transparency works. So the alpha transparency responds to that which was created first, and then the camera wants to draw things in the order in which they appear to the camera. So ideally, you want to put your items into the scene beginning with the most foreground object and moving to the background, and that's kind of counterintuitive. It works opposite of the way you think. There's a way to fix that, and we're not going to worry about the draw order right now. We will set up the draw draw order when we get to the end of our scene creation, and we'll kind of make things right. So first of all, let's bring in a nebula that's already existing. So before we do that, let's turn on our OpenGL render shading, and we'll go to our texture shading, and let's import an image as a plane, and we will go to our space images, and let's select something kind of interesting in the background, but maybe a little bit more flat. We'll go with this one right here. And we want it to be shadeless. We'll import that. We'll scale it up. Move it back in Z space. This is going to be the background image. Now there is a little bit of depth to this. Now one thing that we can do, if it really matters, it probably won't to this, but I'll show you one way without doing camera projection to get a little bit of depth. We'll tab into edit mode, and then I'm going to go to my tools here, and I'm going to hit subdivide. I'm just going to subdivide it once. Oops, that was twice. Control Z, there we go. Subdivide it once, and what we're going to do now is we're going to grab the center vertice, and we're just going to slide this back in Z space a little bit. Go back to our camera view, and you can see that our geometry is a little messed up. But if we move in on it, we can see that we would get a little bit of parallax motion if we move our camera in on it. The sides would open up, and the center would kind of be more distant. We want that to be a little bit cleaner. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over here to selecting our object in the background. We're going to come over here to the modifier stack, and we're going to add a subdivision surface modifier, and then we're going to bump it up a little bit. So it doesn't matter that it rounds off the edges and warps the material a little bit, because we're looking more at the center. But now what we get is we get a smoother sort of curve going on here. If we tab out back to edit mode, we can increase this even more by moving that single vertice. Okay, so this is one way to do it without camera projection. Now the one problem with doing it this way is that it does warp the image. Now that may or may not matter. If you don't want to warp the image, what you would need to do is create geometry like this, and then you would apply the subdivision surface, and then you would select all the vertices in edit mode, and then camera project them, and then apply the material. And we may do that here before the end of this tutorial. We're going to move this forward in Z space a little bit. Back to the camera view. So now what we can do, if we take our camera and we move in on Z space, you can see that there's actually a parallax motion going on. So this is one way to do it. Okay, this is probably the quickest and easiest way to get some depth in an image like this, where there's a very clear center hole to it. Now another thing that you can do, and we're not going to do it right now, but another thing you can do is you can use metaballs to create geometry. Now very quickly what that looks like, without actually having to go through the whole process. If I bring in, say, some of these metaball planes, let me go back to solid viewport shading here, and I duplicate this, I can start to layer these up and create some geometry, and I can essentially mold and shape, and I could use different figures as well, but I could mold and shape a smooth mesh that would generally match the image that I want to project. And then what I could do, add a couple more in here, then what I could do is I could apply this as an object. I could transfer it to an object. You do that down here in the object settings, and up here at the very top it says convert to, and you want to go from see here, mesh from curve, meta, or surface or text. So this is the one you'd want to select, and it would turn this into mesh that's solid. But you can kind of get the idea here. You would build up your structure in the background, and then you would apply that setting, and then you could tab into edit mode, select all the vertices, and then do a camera projection that way. So that's a way to get a little bit more defined and clear. Let's get rid of this. We don't need it. All of these. There's still metadata there. Okay, Go back to the camera view. It probably won't matter in this case, but we may want to apply smooth shading on our background image. So let's go back to texture mode and move on. So there's a couple of ideas in terms of camera projection, very similar to what we were doing with the planets in the last tutorial that you can do without getting into it. Let's bring some foreground objects into this and see if we can expand this out. We might want to have some stars in there, a bit of a star field, so let's do that. We will import another image as a plane. And we'll grab our generic star field right here, make it shadeless. And we'll scale this up. Again, you don't want to go too big with stars. And then we will go to the game engine, select our material, and we'll turn on the add value. Go back to the game engine, or back to the Blender render. We're going to select the node option and open up a node editor. Then we will select our material here, which is the star field, and we will just add a curve, RGB curve. And what we can do is we can kind of tighten down this color space a bit. There's a lot of lighter colors in it. So the way we'll do that is we'll just bring down the darks. And if we need, we can bring up some of the lights. You probably don't need to do too much of that. Just to get some of those stars to pop out, mostly just the bigger stars, a little bit of that haze. And that gives a little bit of depth. Come back to the camera viewport. Now if we take our camera, and why don't we turn on our rendered viewport here. So we'll turn on only render, world background, not that it matters. We'll select our camera, and you can see that our draw order is incorrect. So because we have some limited items, one thing we can do is just select the foreground object, and we'll come down here to the object settings and turn on transparency. So now we go back to the, oh, that didn't work at all. Let's try that again. I think I had the wrong one selected. Yeah. There we go. We want this one selected. Turn on transparency, and we go to the camera, and now everything will work. Now this works when you only have one or two items, or 2 or 3 items, I should say. If you have more than that, which we will, then it won't work. But if we take our camera and we now move in on Z space, you can see that now we have another layer of items. There's kind of a space dust and some star kind of figures there in the foreground, which will add a little bit more to our motion when we move our camera later on. Okay, so let's add a few more things. I might move this back in Z space just a little bit, and we'll scale it up. Now that might be enough for your scene. You might just use that and make a camera move based on that, and that can be one scene that would be perfectly fine for an animation such as what we're creating here. Let's kind of one-up this a little bit. Let's add another image. Import image as plane. And we're actually going to use the same... let's use... Yeah, we'll use this one over here. So there's another nebula that I've got that's got a little bit of a softer kind of feel to it. We want it to be shadeless as well. Scale that up. And we're going to move this forward a bit so that we have 3 layers, 1, 2, 3. On this one, we're going to add to it the ability to use nodes. We'll go to the node editor. We're going to select this image, which is Nebula 5. We're going to generate some transparency, but we want to kind of pull some of these clouds out of the image, some of the more dense parts here. We're going to do that by using the lighter colors. So the way this will work is we will add to this first a color, hue, and saturation. We're going to take the saturation all the way down and make it a black and white image. Then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to add to that a curve. And then on this curve, we're going to crunch in the blacks. And then we're going to increase the contrast a little bit by bringing the darks down a little bit more, and then we'll bring the lights up. And what this is going to do is it's going to take the lighter color, and it's going to kind of extract that as our image, so you can see what's going on here. Okay. Now what we can do is we can apply the this output as the alpha, and then apply the original image as the color. And what it will do is it will take some of these elements out. Now it looks like we need to increase this a little bit. So why don't I move this blacks back a little bit, just to get a little bit more color space in there. We'll increase our contrast quite a bit more. And then we'll move this into space here and see if we can find a good place for this image. There's a lot of detail that we don't want to cover up. Let's rotate it a bit on the z-axis. Again, we don't want to have our margins sticking through there, so maybe scale it up a bit. So that might be good right about here. So now what we have, again, if I go to my camera, we have a problem with our draw order. Now we've got 3 items, so we have a problem here. Let's quickly get the draw order right. We're going to add here an empty. And then what we're going to do in the scene is we're going to select our objects from the, it doesn't really matter what we do, what order we do them in. We're just going to parent these to the empty. So we'll drag and drop them into the empty. Then we'll open up the empty tree here, and we want to go from the foreground to the background. So we'll select our most foreground image, which is the Nebula 5, and we're going to unparent it by dragging it back out again. Then we'll go to the star field, and we will unparent that by dragging it out again, and then we'll take the back Nebula 1 and drag that out again. Now if we go back to our camera, we'll see that our draw order is right now. So as far as Blender is concerned, when we do that, just as a review, when we do that, it's as if we're recreating these images, these objects, new in the scene when we unparent them. That's how Blender understands the parenting and unparenting. You can also do this with objects, with groups of objects. So if I had these like this and I parented them foreground to background to that empty, I could treat that empty as one object, and I could do that with other empties as well. And so long as the empties are in the right draw order, then everything will be in the proper draw order, group by group. So that might sound complicated, but you want to go check the Hacking the Viewport tutorial series to learn more about that. So if we grab our camera now and we move it through Z-space, we can see that we get quite a bit of three-dimensional perspective now. So not only is the nebula in the background giving us some parallax motion, we can even increase that quite a bit just by grabbing that image and scaling it on the Z-axis and then moving it forward. We go back to our camera view. And now if we scale it on the X-axis and then scale it on the Y-axis to kind of condense it back down again, now we go back to our camera viewport. We should get a lot of parallax motion here. Now we've really messed around with the projection image, so it gives us kind of a vortex look. But that might be kind of cool here. If we take our camera and we move forward in Z-space, we can almost move through this nebula and through the star field. Now I'm seeing a little bit of issue here with some of our draw order on the front object concerning the second object. I'm not sure why that is, because it should be taken care of. One thing we might do is go back to our center object, the star field, and remove our transparency setting and see if that fixes it. I think we're good now. So now if we go back to the camera view, I think we're all set. So some of those, that one item that we added before actually created a problem for us. So now with all the settings right, we can move through in Z-space and we see everything in 3 dimensions, and we get kind of one version of this. Now we can add a flare in there, and you've seen how we do that before. Very quickly, I'll open up another image, import an image as a plane. We'll grab a different flare. We've been using kind of the same flare for a while. Let's grab this one here. It's kind of interesting. And we'll scale it up. And what we want to do for this one is we're going to turn on the X-ray setting. So we don't need to actually fix any draw order issues with this one. And then we're going to go to the game engine. And we will turn this to the alpha add blend mode. And we'll move it back. In fact, let's try something here. We're going to make this look like it's in space. So it's in the foreground, not necessarily fully in the background. Go back to our camera view here, and I'll expand this out. And this might be kind of the center of attention here in this scene, but we'll move it down out of the way a little bit. So if I go to my camera and I move forward in Z space, I'm actually approaching this light source. It's out here somewhere, out there. So I could put a flicker on that by adding some noise, which you've seen in some of the other tutorials, and I would have a complete scene there now with a lens flare as well. Let me get rid of that streak. We don't need it. Let's look at some other possibilities here. Let's say that we want to add some kinds of wispy streaks out in the foreground. I'm going to move some of these materials back a little bit. So give us a little bit more foreground space. Let's expand this one out again. There we go. We're going to import another image. And we're going to grab a smoke element. We're going to grab this one right here. Okay, so smoke number 3. It's a very wispy kind of low resolution, not in terms of video graphics, but low resolution in terms of size of the element. Kind of a small smoke element here. We'll import that. Go back to our Blender render here. We'll scale it up. And we're going to move this, make sure that it's way out in the foreground here. Scale it up some more and rotate it on the Z-axis. And we're going to set this, actually probably better if we put it down here in this corner. Make kind of a different sort of nebular element out here. And what we want to do is we're going to leave it as is. We're not going to change anything about the image in terms of setting it to the Blender game transparency. We want this to actually be an alpha transparent image, so we're not going to set it to add blend mode. What we want to do though is we want to add another texture. Actually, we're going to add another material here in a second. Let's add a material below that, and in this material we're going to make it shadeless, and in the texture slot we're going to add another image that is another nebula. So let's add a different one, such as, let's say this one out here. Well, I don't know. Maybe we'll use this one again. Okay, so this is applied now to the UV map of this image, even though we can't see it. What we want to do is we're going to select smoke, the smoke image here. We're going to turn on the ability to work on this with nodes. We want to select our material, smoke 3, but then we want to make another material. So we're going to add a different material node. And for this material node, we're going to select our additional material, material 1. And material 1 is going to be the input for the color. And then we're going to use the smoke element as the input for the alpha channel. Okay, and if we then, actually let's look real quick at this smoke. Let's add to this a RGB curve, and we'll increase the contrast a bit. We'll bring up the lighter colors. In fact, we may not even need to increase the contrast. We're just going to brighten it up quite a bit. Make it really bright. Now what we're going to do is we're going to apply this to the alpha, and then we'll apply the nebula to the color. And you can see that we have kind of another variation on this material applied to a different sort of formation. One thing we might do, though, is we'll add another color RGB curve, and we'll darken up these foreground colors a little bit. So now if we select our camera, we'll see that our draw order is bad again. Now, I've already set my draw order for everything else. I don't necessarily need to go through the parenting thing again if I've already decided that this is the last element I'm going to have. If I know that's the case, I'm just going to go to the object mode and turn on transparency for that one image, and everything should work together fine now. So if you go back to the camera view, we can see that all of our transparency works. So you can kind of mix and match here as you get down to the end of your scene. So now, as I take the camera and I move through Z space, you'll see that I've got a really interesting kind of shot with a little bit of different geometry. I've got these softer clouds out here, kind of these harder streaks out here, and then I've got my background, which is set in three-dimensional space, plus a star field in there. So let's say I make an animation that's 120 frames long. Again, you don't want really big moves because it can mess up the scale. Let's rotate the camera on the z-axis a little bit here. And I'll insert a location rotation key point. We'll go to the end. We'll go in on Z space. And I'll rotate it on the Z axis out this way. And I'll insert another location rotation. We'll go to the graph editor, hit V, select vector. And now I can play my animation. So that is the creation of Nebula in a nutshell. You can use the same kind of idea with camera projection. I want to show that to you very quickly here. So let's take everything that's in the scene and we'll delete it except for the camera. And we'll turn off our rendering here for a second. We're just going to leave the camera move the way it is. We'll just use that one. But we're going to bring in another image, but we're going to do it a different way. We're going to do it with camera projection. So let's quickly add some mesh. We'll add a plane. We'll scale this up. Then we're going to tab into edit mode. And we're going to subdivide it just once. And I'm going to select the center vertice, and we'll do the same kind of morphing trick that we did before. And tab out of edit mode, and then we will select our modifier stack, and we'll add a subdivision surface modifier, crank it up. And then we're going to just apply it straight away. Now if we go back to the camera and we tab into edit mode, and on the mesh, you want to select all. We can see what the mesh looks like now. Okay, let's kind of get to a place where we can project here. So without moving our camera, let's select the camera, and we need to find that image very quickly that we're going to use. So let's see, we should have a nebula in here to use. We'll use this one, Crab Nebula. And I need to find out what the size of this is. So the image size is 3864 by 3864 square. So I'm going to make my camera dimensions, my output, 3864 by 3864. I already know what the image sort of looks like, so I don't really need to import it. I know that the center of the image is in the center of the frame. So without bringing in the background image to line it up like what we did with the planet tutorial, all I'm going to do is take my background plane and just kind of scale it up a little bit. And I might scale it on the z-axis to kind of give it a little bit more depth. And then I'm going to tab into edit mode, and I'm going to come over here to my shading. And I will select for UV mapping, project from view. So now I tab out, I'll go over here to the material settings for my plane, hit new, I'll select shadeless, then on the texture slot we'll add a new texture, and we'll open up our image that we're going to be projecting, which is going to be this one right here. So now I can see my nebula in space here on my geometry, and it's got kind of a funnel cone sort of shape to it. So this one's really interesting. If I put my camera resolution back to where I want it to be, 1920 by 1080, full HD, and I look at my camera move, see if this works out. You can see it appears as if we're moving into this nebula, that we're kind of driving into it further and further. Now if I really want to make this look even more drastic, what I can do is move my nebula closer in space to the camera, and then widen out my camera focal length. And now if I play it back, I get a lot more parallax motion as I'm moving in on it. And actually one of the shots in the little short film here is just this. That's really all that's going on. Now I did one more thing to add a little bit of depth to it. I added another plane in the background that has some stars on it. So I want to make my horizon color black to do it this way. Actually, I probably didn't need to do that, but that's okay. We'll import another image as a plane. We'll go to our trusty star field, make sure it's shadeless, and I'm going to move this way back here outside the tip of the nebula. We'll scale it up, and I'm going to make this image X-ray so that it shines through everything. Now I have it already set because I've already used this texture as a material once. It thinks that it's on the old node setup. So what I want to do is select that and go to my node tree, and I might want to decrease my contrast a little bit. And now I want to go to my game engine, and for the material I want to select add. So now if I go back to my camera, now I'm looking at stars in the background through space here. Let me make my star field a little bit smaller. So now as my camera moves forward, I'm getting parallax motion with the star field that's in the background. It gives it even more three-dimensional depth. And this is pretty amazing. Just the way the texture works, it almost looks like this stuff is sticking out in space, even though it's not. So you can really get away with a lot with some textures. So that's all I have for you today. I wish you the best of luck with this, and happy blending.